The words landed like a blade against glass. I've chosen a life without you. They fell not in the privacy of our home, but in the glittering din of a five-star restaurant where family and friends had gathered to celebrate my son's graduation. The clinking of cutlery stilled. Dozens of heads turned toward us. Adrien, my husband of nearly 3 decades, still held his champagne flute aloft as if mid-toast, his voice echoing above the stunned silence. I sat motionless, his declaration humming in my ears like static. No gasps escaped my lips. No tears spilled onto my dress. The audience expected drama, rage, fainting, perhaps a shattered glass. Instead, I offered a smile so controlled it almost frightened me. "Thank you for your honesty," I said evenly. "My name is Lillian Marrow, 53 years old. For years I had played the part. Wife, supporter, shadow. I gave up my own aspirations so Adrien could chase endless ventures. Failed startups, wild career reinventions, fleeting obsessions he dressed up as passion. I carried our family while he wandered, making excuses for him when creditors called, hiding the stress lines from our son, Daniel. And now, in the moment meant to honor Daniel's triumph, Adrien had staged his grand unveiling. But while he thought he held the spotlight, he had forgotten something crucial. I had been rehearsing my own script. And the envelope resting in my purse that evening contained the first act of a performance that would undo him entirely. Adrien's smug gaze darted past me to the far end of the room where Serena Vale sat. Young, polished, and unervingly composed, she was more than just his mistress. She had been a guest in our home, a woman I had once offered advice to, even trusted. Now she shifted uneasily in her chair, her discomfort a crack in her carefully constructed mask. The betrayal stung less from Adrien than from the circle around us. Friends who knew. Friends who whispered. Friends who smiled at my table while hiding Serena at theirs. Their silence was louder than his confession. With deliberate calm, I reached into my handbag and slid a cream-colored envelope onto Adrien's dinner plate. He looked down, confused, his grin faltering. "What's this?" he asked. "Something for later," I replied. My voice didn't waver. I kissed Daniel's cheek and whispered, "I am proud of you. Don't let today be defined by anything else." His eyes were wide with horror, but I pressed on. Then I rose, smoothing the folds of my navy dress. "Please enjoy your meal," I told the hushed crowd. "Today is still worth celebrating." Dozens of eyes clung to me as I walked away, shoulders square, chin high. Behind me, Adrien's voice broke through, shrill and demanding, "Lillian, what have you done?" But I didn't stop. Outside, the heavy summer air wrapped around me, warm and liberating. For the first time in years, I inhaled without the weight of pretense. He thought this was his stage. He thought he had scripted my downfall. What he didn't know was that I had been preparing my own climax, one that would strip him bare. The house greeted me like a museum of memories. Photographs on the staircase, the antique clock my mother had left me, the sofa where promises had once been made. But beneath the familiar, change simmered. Adrien's neatly packed suitcases, hidden in the back of the closet, confirmed what I already knew. His exit was rehearsed, just like his announcement. I smiled at his predictability. He was meticulous with his wardrobe, careless with everything else. For months, I had noticed subtle irregularities in our joint accounts, transfers too small to alarm most, but glaring to a woman who had managed finances professionally for decades. Adrien thought I was blind, too occupied with Daniel's graduation and household duties to notice. But I had noticed. And instead of confrontation, I had waited. I had investigated. I had documented. I had turned intuition into evidence. When I first found the text messages, his promises of freedom, Serena's giddy affirmations of their new beachfront life, I sat in the dark kitchen, phone in hand, rage cooling into strategy. Adrien didn't understand numbers, not really. But I did. I understood money trails, contracts, and most of all, the ironclad prenuptial agreement he had once demanded to protect himself. The same agreement buried in legalese that contained a fidelity clause. His arrogance had blinded him to the fact that the very shield he had once crafted now stood sharpened in my hand. That envelope I left on his plate wasn't just paper. It was the opening move in a war he didn't even know had started. I had always been the stabilizer in our marriage. When Adrien poured our savings into a doomed restaurant with an old friend, I worked late nights to cover tuition and bills. When his soul-searching demanded yet another career shift, I shelved my own dream of building a consultancy for women, telling myself, after Daniel graduates, after Adrien finds his footing. But Adrien never wanted footing. He wanted flight, reckless, self-serving, and always expecting me to be the net. 3 months before graduation, when I uncovered his secret transfers, I nearly confronted him. Instead, I let silence become my accomplice. I traced every transaction. I copied every message. I assembled a case thicker than the novels stacked by my bed. When I read his words, "She trusts me completely," that's her weakness. Something inside me split cleanly. Love calcified into resolve. The irony was almost poetic. He planned to humiliate me publicly at our son's milestone, parading Serena as his future. Yet I had already filed divorce papers quietly, 3 days before the ceremony. He believed he would walk away with money, property, dignity. He was wrong. Every move he made had been anticipated. Every lie catalogued. Every asset mapped. When he opened that envelope after his triumphant speech, he wouldn't just be reading legal documents. He would be staring into the mirror of his own undoing. I didn't linger at the restaurant. Instead, I drove back to the colonial house we had called home for 15 years. A house Adrien had already promised Serena in the naive comfort of text messages. He thought secrecy meant safety. But nothing was hidden from me. Upstairs, I found his bags ready for departure. I laughed softly. He thought he was orchestrating an escape. He never realized I had already cut the ropes of his parachute. My phone vibrated endlessly. Messages from friends who had watched the spectacle, from relatives, from Daniel. Only to my son did I reply, "I'm okay. This isn't yours to carry. Celebrate today. We'll talk tonight." Protecting him had been my mission through all of this. He would resent me for keeping the truth hidden, but I had wanted him to cross that stage free of shadows. Hours later, the sound of Adrien's car crunched into the driveway. The door slammed. His voice thundered through the house, sharp and desperate. "Lillian, where are you?" I sat in the living room, laptop closed, documents stacked beside me. Calm as stone. When he appeared, his face flushed, the envelope crumpled in his hand. He spat the words, "You served me today. On our son's graduation." I met his fury with stillness. "I thought it fit your plans," I said quietly. "You wanted a new life. I'm simply making sure you get one." The moment he realized the fidelity clause had not expired, the moment color drained from his face. That was the true toast of the evening. Adrien's anger filled the room like smoke, but I stayed seated, my posture deliberate, my voice calm. He waved the papers in the air, his confidence cracking. "The prenup expired years ago," he sneered, clinging to arrogance. "Any lawyer will tell you that." I tilted my head, almost pitying him. "Actually, it didn't. Section 13 specifies that the fidelity clause holds for the duration of the marriage. Maybe you should have read it more carefully before signing." The words landed like bricks. His face drained, and for once in our marriage, Adrien was speechless. I remembered every time I'd covered for him. When creditors called, when his reckless ventures collapsed, when he played the dreamer while I played the anchor. He had mistaken my silence for weakness. Now he was realizing silence can also be strategy. He sank into the leather sofa, rubbing his forehead. His phone buzzed incessantly, Serena, no doubt, demanding updates. He ignored it, sweat beading at his temple. "You can't do this to me," he whispered. "You did it to yourself," I replied softly. "Every transfer, every lie, every message. You left a trail even a novice could follow. And you underestimated the one person who has always been 10 steps ahead of you." For the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of losing me, he had lost me long ago, but the fear of losing the life he thought he controlled. That night my phone lit up with messages from family and friends. Some sympathetic, others hungry for gossip. I replied only to Daniel. "I'm fine. This isn't your weight to bear." For months I had carried the burden alone, shielding him from the storm brewing inside our home. I wanted his final semester free of shadows, his graduation day untouched by betrayal. I knew he'd be angry when the truth emerged, but eventually he would understand. Daniel was my reason for every calculated move. He had Adrien's charm but my steadiness, a rare balance that propelled him forward. He didn't need to carry the weight of his father's selfishness. That was mine to dismantle. Hours after Adrien stormed out of the restaurant, I sat in the quiet living room, sipping tea as though the day had been ordinary. The house still smelled faintly of celebration. The roses Daniel's friends had given him, the champagne I never tasted. When Adrien returned, he came in with fury, slamming the door so hard the clock rattled. He stormed into the room waving the envelope. "You're calculating." "We've built nearly 3 decades together. Does that mean nothing to you?" "It meant everything," I answered, my voice steady. "That's why your betrayal cuts as deep as it does. This wasn't a mistake, Adrien. It was a year-long plan. A scheme." He opened his mouth, then closed it, trapped in the net of his own choices. He tried a different tactic then, softening his voice. "Maybe we can fix this, Lil. People make mistakes. I made a mistake." I almost laughed. A mistake was forgetting an anniversary, misplacing paperwork, burning dinner. What he had done was far more deliberate. He had siphoned money, courted another woman, promised her the very walls around us. "This wasn't a mistake," I said firmly. "This was betrayal with a budget and a blueprint." I reached for my phone, unlocked it and pressed play. His own voice filled the room. "After the graduation I'll tell her. A public setting is better. She won't make a scene." Serena's voice followed. "And she has no idea about the money?" His answer: "None. Lillian trusts me completely. That's her weakness." The blood drained from his face. He lunged forward. "You recorded us? That's illegal." "Not here," I replied coolly. "One-party consent is enough. And besides, I didn't record your private moments. Just the ones where you planned to defraud me." He staggered back, shaken. The bravado was gone. He muttered about needing to make calls. "Yes," I said lightly. "Start with your attorney. You'll need one." I gathered my overnight bag. "I'll be at Margaret's tonight." His head snapped up. "Pie sister." I nodded. "She saw you and Serena together first. You should have kept your promises to her. She chose truth over silence." The realization hit him like a slap. Even his own blood had sided with me. Margaret's house was small, lined with bookshelves and sunlight. She had never married, choosing instead her independence and career as a professor. That evening when I arrived at her door, she pulled me into a hug so fierce I nearly broke. "I just heard from Daniel," she said, ushering me inside. "Are you okay?" "I'm better than expected," I admitted. Though Adrien's announcement was dramatic. Margaret poured wine as we settled into her sunroom, surrounded by potted ferns. "Dramatic? He humiliated you in front of half the city." "That was the plan," I replied. "A public rejection so I'd look hysterical if I fought back." She shook her head. "My brother always did crave spectacle. But this? It's cruelty." When she asked what was in the envelope, I told her. The divorce petition, the evidence, the prenup. She laughed bitterly. "I remember when he insisted on that prenup. He was so obsessed with protecting himself. The irony is exquisite." I smiled faintly. It was poetic justice, yes, but more than that, it was survival. My phone rang. "Daniel." His voice was tight, trembling with anger. "I'm coming over. Dad is telling everyone you've lost your mind." "Let him," I said softly. "The truth always rises." But Daniel was already on his way. When Daniel arrived, still in his graduation attire, mascara streaks from tears on his cheeks, he collapsed into my arms. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to taint your final semester," I explained. "I wanted this day to belong to you." "Well, he ruined it anyway," Daniel said bitterly. We sat in Margaret's living room and I laid bare the truth. The affair, the stolen funds, the staged humiliation. Daniel listened, fists clenched, eyes dark with rage. I knew something was off. He was different. Distracted. Always on his phone. But I never thought. He stopped, choking on the words. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "None of us want to see the darkness in those we love. But sometimes it can't be ignored." As if summoned by our words, my phone buzzed with a message from Philip, my attorney. The court had approved the emergency filing. The accounts were frozen. Adrien's empire of lies had been caged. I showed the text to Margaret and Daniel. My son's jaw tightened. "Good. He deserves it." I touched his cheek. "He's still your father. That bond is yours to navigate. But for me, the line is drawn." The doorbell rang, slicing through the quiet. Margaret returned a moment later, her face troubled. "It's Adrien," she said. "And he's not alone." And just like that, the storm had arrived at our doorstep. Adrien walked into Margaret's living room as though he still owned the air around him. But his swagger was brittle now, a performance collapsing mid-act. Beside him stood Serena, her posture uneasy, her eyes darting to the floor. For someone who had spent months weaving herself into the fabric of my life, she suddenly looked like she wanted to disappear. "You need to stop this madness, Lillian," Adrien barked, his voice trembling at the edges. "Unfreeze the accounts. We can sit down and discuss this like adults." Daniel rose from his chair, moving slightly in front of me, his jaw clenched. "Maybe you should have acted like an adult before announcing to the world you were leaving Mom on my graduation day." Adrien flinched, as if only just realizing our son was part of this confrontation. "Daniel, this doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" Daniel's voice cracked with disbelief. "You destroyed our family at my celebration. You stole money while telling me to pick up extra shifts because things were tight. How does this not concern me?" Serena tugged at Adrien's sleeve. "Greg, maybe we should." "Quiet," he snapped, brushing her off. I remained seated, calm as stone. For years I had been the mediator, the one to keep peace. Tonight I allowed the silence to convict him. The man who thought he controlled every narrative was suddenly being outflanked by his own son, his mistress, his sister, and me. And for the first time I sensed he knew it. The room pulsed with tension, every breath tight. Adrien's face was flushed, his composure gone. "This is vindictive, Lillian." "It isn't you." I met his eyes. "Perhaps you never really knew me. Just as I never really knew you." Daniel turned to Serena, his voice low but sharp. "Did you know he planned to humiliate my mom in front of everyone? Did you know he drained our accounts while I worked 2 jobs to pay for books?" Serena's cheeks flushed crimson. "I thought," she faltered, glancing at Adrien. "I thought he was going to talk to her privately. The restaurant stunt wasn't part of the plan." Adrien's glare could have burned through steel. Already, cracks were splitting the facade of their united front. Margaret folded her arms, her voice like iron. "You've upset enough people for one night, Adrien. Take your theatrics elsewhere." But he refused to leave, digging his heels in like a child denied his toy. "The accounts stay frozen for 3 days until the hearing," I said evenly. "The judge will decide division then." His eyes bulged. 3 days? What am I supposed to do for 3 days? "You have your personal account," I replied, letting the word personal cut like a knife. "The one you thought I didn't know about." Serena's head whipped toward him. "What personal account?" And just like that, his mistress realized she hadn't been granted full access to his secrets either. The empire of lies he had built was collapsing, brick by brick, under the weight of truth. The silence that followed was electric. Serena's face hardened, betrayal flickering across her features. "How much is in this account, Adrien?" she pressed. He ignored her, his focus locked on me. "This is vindictive," he repeated, desperation dripping from his voice. "No," I corrected him. "This is justice. Maybe for the first time in your life, you're seeing the consequences of your own choices." Daniel's voice cut in, firm and unwavering. "I can't look at you right now, Dad. You paraded Serena through our lives like she was invisible. You lied about money while I broke my back to make ends meet. And then you tried to destroy Mom in public. You don't deserve my respect." The words landed like thunder. Adrien staggered slightly, as though his own son's rejection had winded him. Serena shifted awkwardly, arms crossed. "You should go," Margaret said firmly. "Both of you. This house doesn't welcome cruelty." Adrien hesitated at the door, his eyes narrowing at me. "This isn't over, Lillian. I'll fight you on this." I met his gaze steadily, a small smile at the corner of my lips. "You're welcome to try." As the door closed behind him, Daniel slumped onto the sofa, tears welling in his eyes. I've never spoken to him like that. I wrapped my arm around his shoulders. Sometimes standing up for what's right means breaking something inside you. But it's the only way forward. For the first time I felt the tide turning, not just for me but for all of us. The courtroom was small, but the tension inside it was monumental. Rain streaked the windows as I sat beside Philip, my attorney. Across the aisle, Adrien fidgeted with his tie. His lawyer, a young associate clearly out of his depth, shuffled papers nervously. The judge, an older woman with hawk-like eyes, reviewed the prenuptial agreement carefully. Section 18 states, she read aloud, that the fidelity clause remains valid for the full duration of the marriage, including any proceedings resulting from dissolution. She peered over her glasses. There is no expiration date indicated. Adrien leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously. The young man's face paled. And furthermore, the judge continued, flipping through exhibits, the documented transfers appear to violate disclosure requirements under Section 23. This court is ruling to maintain the freeze on joint accounts pending discovery. Mr. Marrow's personal account will remain accessible, but the marital home remains under Mrs. Marrow's possession, per the infidelity clause. Adrien's face burned crimson. This is outrageous, he muttered. The judge's eyes pinned him. What's outrageous, sir, is failing to understand the very document you signed. This court reconvenes in 30 days for the full hearing. Until then, the orders stand. I rose as the gavel fell, my hands steady. Adrien caught up with me in the hallway, his voice a desperate hiss. Please, Lil. Nearly 30 years together. Doesn't that count for anything? I paused, meeting his eyes with a calmness he couldn't fathom. It counted for everything. Until you decided it didn't. And then I walked away, leaving him in the echo of his own ruin. Word spread quickly. Friends who once smiled across dinner tables now whispered behind phones. Some reached out with sympathy, others fishing for gossip. I gave the same reply every time. Adrien and I are separating. These things happen. But behind the polite curtain, I watched his facade crumble. His finances frozen. His business floundering without my quiet management. The promises he made to Serena, beachfront homes, cars, luxury, evaporated like mist. 2 weeks later, Margaret called, amusement in her voice. Have you heard the latest? Serena's gone. Already? I asked, though I wasn't surprised. She told a friend she didn't sign up to bankroll a man drowning in debt. I allowed myself a quiet laugh. Adrien had always been skilled at illusions, but illusions can't pay rent. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding. The emergency account I had always maintained in my own name gave me freedom he never anticipated. I rented a modest office downtown and began what I had delayed for decades. A consultancy for women in transition. My first clients were 2 women navigating divorces of their own. Word spread. More came. Each session filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't known in years. Daniel, now working in Charleston, called often. I'm proud of you, Mom, he said one evening. You're helping people when they need it most. I'm just giving them what I wish someone had given me, I replied. The woman who once lived in Adrien's shadow was gone. In her place was someone new, stronger, freer, and finally awake. The final hearing arrived on what would have been our 29th wedding anniversary. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. A chapter closing exactly on the day we had once sworn forever. Adrien looked diminished, his tailored suit hanging looser than usual, his skin sallow from restless nights. Serena was long gone, already spotted on the arm of a wealthy developer in Savannah. Most of our mutual friends had distanced themselves, unwilling to stand beside a man exposed as both adulterer and fraud. The courtroom was still, heavy with anticipation. The judge reviewed the prenuptial agreement once more, this time with finality. The document is valid. Mrs. Marrow retains the marital home, her retirement accounts, and 70% of joint investments as stipulated. Mr. Marrow leaves with his personal possessions, his private account, and any liabilities attached to his business. Adrien's shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of him like air from a punctured balloon. His empire of illusions had collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance. As we exited, he approached me one last time. His voice was quiet, raw. I made a mistake. Is there any chance at all? I looked at him for what felt like the final time. No, Adrien. That door is closed. It was perhaps the first moment he truly understood what loss meant. Not the loss of money or property, but the loss of the one person who had carried him for decades. And I, for the first time in years, walked away lighter. 6 months later, my consultancy, Marrow Financial Transitions, was thriving. What had begun in a modest downtown office had grown into something bigger than I imagined. I had moved to a larger space, hired 2 associates, and carved out a mission, guiding women through financial upheaval. Divorces, widowhood, career transitions. I helped them find clarity where once I had felt only chaos. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was building. Daniel visited often, proud of what I had created. One afternoon, as he leaned against my desk, he said, "You know what's ironic? If Dad had just been honest, he might have kept half of everything." I smiled, though the truth of his words stung. Sometimes people can't see past what they want in the moment. And that blindness costs them everything. At night, I'd reflect on the journey. The envelope I handed Adrien at that restaurant had not only ended a marriage, it had opened a door. Behind it lay a life I hadn't dared dream. Independence, purpose, and the rediscovery of myself. I was no longer just a wife, no longer just a mother. I was a mentor, an advocate, and a woman reborn. The woman Adrien had underestimated was gone. The woman standing in her place was unshakable. Rebuilding wasn't without its storms. Adrien tried in subtle ways to reframe the story. He called old friends, spinning himself as the victim of a cold, calculating wife. He suggested to Daniel that I had been plotting for years, as if protecting myself was a crime. But the truth has a way of carving its own path. Words spread of the evidence, the recordings, the financial transfers. Friends who had once doubted me now turned silent when Adrien's name was mentioned. His business faltered without my quiet hand behind the books. His calls for sympathy fell flat. Meanwhile, I thrived. Each client I helped reminded me of my own journey. One woman sobbed across my desk, saying, "I don't know how to start over." I clasped her hands and said, "I do. And I'll show you." That was the gift Adrien never saw coming. In breaking me, he had handed me my calling. Daniel often told me, "You're stronger than anyone I know." But I didn't feel strong. I felt awake. Awake to my own worth, awake to my own power. And when I thought back to that restaurant, to the moment Adrien raised his glass to announce his escape, I no longer felt the sting. I felt gratitude. Because his betrayal had set me free. One evening, months after the divorce was finalized, I received a call from Margaret. "You'll want to hear this," she said. "Adrien's business filed for bankruptcy." I closed my eyes, not in triumph but in inevitability. Without the facade of my support, his world had crumbled exactly as I had always feared it would. Later that week, I saw him outside the courthouse. He looked older, his arrogance hollowed into weariness. For a moment we locked eyes. He approached, hesitating. "Lillian," he said softly, I hope you're happy. Truly." It was perhaps the most honest thing he had ever spoken. "I am," I answered simply. And it was true. Walking away that day, I realized I no longer carried anger. The revenge had never been about destroying him. It had been about reclaiming myself. And in that, I had succeeded beyond measure. The life he thought he had stolen from me had only been a doorway to the life I was meant to build. The consultancy became more than a business. It became a refuge. Women came with stories etched in pain, betrayals, losses, sudden upheavals. And together we turned their chaos into clarity, their fear into plans, their brokenness into resilience. Every time I helped a woman reclaim her voice, I felt a piece of myself knit stronger. I understood their grief because I had lived it. I understood their rage because I had swallowed it. And I understood their hope because I had clawed my way back to it. Daniel, now thriving in his own career, often said, "Mom, you're teaching people what strength looks like." But I knew the truth. Strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about breaking and still choosing to rise. Looking back, I could almost laugh at the irony. Adrien thought he was discarding me for a younger woman, a brighter life. But in doing so, he had discarded his greatest anchor. He had mistaken devotion for weakness. He had mistaken patience for blindness. And he had taught me the most valuable lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's reinvention. The email arrived just after midnight, subject line, "I owe you the truth." It was from Serena. I stared at her name glowing in the dark, feeling the old heat rise, bracing for more venom. Instead, her message was clipped, almost clinical. She apologized, briefly without embellishment, and then detailed things I hadn't known. Promises Adrien made, lies he told her, and one thing that jolted me upright. He had tried to open a line of credit months earlier using a signature that looked dangerously like mine. The application failed, flagged as inconsistent, but it existed. She attached a scan. Rage didn't come. Calculation did. I forwarded the documents to Philip and to my bank's fraud department, then pulled up a folder labeled contingencies. Inside were notarized signature samples, dated affidavits, and a paper trail I'd built quietly in those long months of pretending not to know. The next morning I was at the bank before the doors fully unlocked. I watched the manager's face change as I slid Serena's attachment across the desk and matched it against my documented signatures. "This is a close imitation," he said softly. "But not close enough. Close enough to burn my life down if I hadn't prepared," I thought. I walked out into the hard winter light and breathed. Survival had rewritten my instincts. I no longer reacted, I preempted. By noon, Philip had filed a protective notice and the bank had added layered verification to my accounts. That evening Serena texted again. "I know you don't owe me anything." I told him I was done. "I thought you should have the evidence." I typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on the only one that felt honest. "Thank you." Not forgiveness. Not absolution. Just a clean acknowledgement in a life I was determined to keep clean. In late spring I stood behind a lectern at the community center, the room filled with women whose faces mirrored every version of my former self. Startled, angry, tired, resolute. My workshop was called Financial Fire Drills, a phrase that made people smile until I outlined exactly why drills save lives. I taught them how to build a go-bag for money. Copies of deeds, prenups, passwords, beneficiaries, credit freezes, power of attorney templates. Proof that luck favors the prepared. Midway through I caught sight of Daniel at the back, arms folded, a grin he tried to hide. When the session ended, a line formed. One woman trembled as she handed me a folder. "I didn't think I could do this," she whispered. "But I watched you. I think, maybe I can." "You already did," I said, and the tremor in her hands stilled. Outside, the air smelled of cut grass and rain. I found Daniel leaning against my car. "You were good," he said, teasing. "Almost like you've lived this." We laughed, and then his expression shifted. "Dad called," he said. "He wants to meet. Says he's trying to make amends." The old ache flickered. "Do you want that?" I asked. Daniel stared at the sky a long time. "I want to hear him. I don't want him to keep writing the story alone." We met Adrien the next day at a small cafe. He looked careful, as if any sudden movement might shatter him. He apologized, not with excuses but with names. The lies he told, the friends he used, the debts he hid. He didn't ask me for anything. He asked his son for the chance to keep trying. Outside after Daniel exhaled. "I'm not ready to forgive him," he said. "But I'm ready to stop letting him live in my head." We walked away lighter, the past behind us but not erased. Catalogued, understood, contained. I began renovating the house in pieces, not to erase history but to choose it. The first to go was the heavy, expensive mirror Adrien loved, the one that reflected everything except the truth. In its place, I hung a cluster of black and white photos I had taken long ago and never framed. Daniel's gap-toothed grin, Margaret asleep in an armchair with a book on her chest, my mother's hands braiding dough. Evidence of a life that had always been mine. I painted the kitchen a luminous white and kept the kettle on the stove, a steady heartbeat of warmth. The upstairs office became a sanctuary of order. Binders labeled, files aligned, a tidy tray where a single envelope rested. My new will, my new beneficiaries, my new instructions. It felt less like closure and more like authorship. One Saturday I pulled down a dusty box from the back of my closet. Letters I'd written to no one during the worst years, hospital bracelets from the miscarriages before Daniel, a stack of birthday cards Adrien had bought last minute, signatures still damp. I sat on the floor and cried, not for what I lost but for the woman who held the world together in silence. I wrote her a letter. "You did not fail. You endured. There is a difference." Margaret arrived with garden gloves and impatience. "Enough tears," she declared. "We're planting." We dug a small square near the fence and pressed a fig sapling into the soil. "Figs take time," she said. Then suddenly, fruit. That night the house hummed softly around me. The clock's steady tick, the muted wind, the first creak of settling wood after fresh paint. I realized I loved the sound. It was the noise of a place exhaling. It was the sound of a home deciding to belong to itself again. A letter from the state tax board landed like a stone. An audit connected to Adrien's business filings from the year he began siphoning funds. My name appeared in a footnote, a relic of an old authorization he had never removed. Fear returned in its most familiar disguise. The urge to fix everything quickly, quietly, alone. I brewed tea, set it beside the letter, and did none of that. Instead, I called Philip. I called my accountant. I called Margaret, who arrived with pastry and sarcasm. "We're not frightened," she announced to no one. "We're organized." For 2 taut weeks, my dining table became a war room. Binders opened like disciplined mouths. Spreadsheets stacked in neat towers. We traced transactions, cross-referenced statements, and built a timeline that told the story better than any testimony could. The audit meeting itself was a sterile room with a polite agent, but I felt the old adrenaline spark. How very close my life had hovered to catastrophe, how easily a forged signature could have swallowed me whole. It didn't. The agent's questions were precise. My answers were precise. When it was over, she closed the folder and said, "You've been thorough. You're clear." I stepped outside into a pale sun and laughed, not out of relief but recognition. Fear will always knock. Preparation answers the door. That night Daniel called. "How'd it go?" "Clean," I said. "And I'm keeping it that way." "Proud of you," he replied. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and drafted a new workshop module. Audit armor. What to keep, where to store it, how to build a paper shield before you ever need one. It felt like drawing a map for someone running behind me in the dark, placing lanterns where I once had none. On the 1-year mark of the restaurant night, I returned to the same block. Not to the glittering dining room but to the quiet bench across the street. The city moved around me indifferent. I wrote a letter to the woman I had been. You did what you had to do to survive. Then you did what you needed to do to live. I slipped the note into an envelope and tucked it in my journal beside a different envelope, the one that had once detonated a life. I studied both. One that ended a chapter, one that chose a future. Paper, I realized, had always been my sharpest blade and kindest bomb. Contracts, affidavits, letters, lists. Proof you can write your way out of a burning room if you carry a pen. The consultancy was thriving. We'd launched a small scholarship fund, the FIG grant, to help clients cover legal fees or emergency housing while they rebuilt. Daniel matched my first contribution. Margaret insisted on managing the garden at the office courtyard, figs and all. My days were busy, my nights largely quiet, the kind of quiet that holds a promise rather than a threat. Adrien sent a card at Christmas. No plea, just a line. "I'm sober. I'm working. I hope you're well." I set it in a drawer and wished him the very thing he'd once tried to steal from me: peace. As dusk thinned the sky, I rose from the bench and walked past the restaurant windows. People inside laughed over glasses that glittered under chandeliers. A year ago I had walked away from a toast meant to shatter me. Tonight I didn't flinch at the sound of crystal. I went home to a house that knew my name, to a fig sapling learning the language of light, to a life I authored line by line. The first envelope had been revenge. Every page since had been reinvention. And both in the end were a kind of love, finally, fiercely, toward myself.